Welcome to the Nintendo Wiretap. My name is Amiibo Jason, and on today's episode, we're doing something a bit different. Instead of taking a look at the news, today we're taking a look back at the Nintendo Game Boy. Released 30 years ago yesterday in Japan, the Game Boy is one of my favorite systems of all time. So, without further ado, let's take a look at a very brief history of the Nintendo Game Boy and why it holds such a special place in so many gamers' hearts. Now, Nintendo's first decade in the video game industry brought many revolutionary ideas to the table. There was the introduction of the D-pad, the genius marketing of the NES across the United States, and so many more amazing things. But it was how Nintendo closed out that first 10 years that made one of the biggest dents in the video game industry, and that, of course, is the Game Boy. Now, the Nintendo Game Boy hit store shelves in Tokyo on April 21st, 1989. It was a portable electronic device following in the footsteps of Game & Watch. Game & Watch, if you're not familiar, was a very simple LCD score-chasing experience. Think along the lines of a Tiger handheld, but in my opinion, much better. Now, in this case, instead of having just a unified game, this one had games that you can swap out on the fly, and more or less, it was a miniaturized NES. Needless to say, it was a massive success, with 118 million units being sold to this day. Now, to put that achievement into perspective, take a look at the Wii. Now, the Wii is the home console that many people could argue that brought video gaming into the mainstream in the latter half of the 2000s. Now, the Wii, even though everybody, their mom and their grandma had one, sold 101 million units. Now, the only other Nintendo system to outperform the Game Boy was the Nintendo DS, and in a way, that was one of its successors. Now, the Game Boy's success could not be possible without the involvement of Gunpei Yokoi. He not only designed the system, but also the aforementioned Game & Watch and the D-pad. Without him, Nintendo likely wouldn't be the juggernaut it is today. Sadly, Mr. Yokoi passed away in 1997, a year after splitting with the company after the failed launch of the Virtual Boy. Now, let's put that into perspective. Today, in 2019, VR is the next big thing. Nintendo just launched Labo VR, and VR systems have been out now for several years in the mainstream. And the Virtual Boy, whether you love it or hate it, was so ahead of its time, it's crazy. So, in my opinion, Yokoi was a true visionary ahead of his time. One can only imagine if he was still around today, the amazing things he'd be making with Nintendo. Now, the Game Boy was more than just an important piece of hardware, as plenty of major franchises and characters saw their very first appearance on the system. I mean, everybody knows about Pokemon, which is the highest grossing media franchise now for years, but don't forget Wario, who made his debut in Super Mario Land 2, or Squaresoft kicking off the Mana series with Final Fantasy Adventure. The Game Boy, like the NES and arcades before it, was a breeding ground of new ideas and talent, with the likes of Masahiro Sakurai, who is now best known for painstakingly working on Super Smash Bros. He got his directorial debut with none other than Kirby himself on, you guessed it, the Game Boy. And of course, we can't forget Tetris. Tetris, the simple puzzle game that paired perfectly with the pick-up-and-play nature of the Game Boy. It's no wonder it became the best-selling game on the platform, with a popularity that endures to this day. I mean, Tetris 99 just came out on the Switch, and if you haven't tried it out yet, it's addicting and amazing. Now, the Game Boy branding survived for almost 2 decades, with the Pocket, the Game Boy Light, the Game Boy Color, Advance, Advance SP, and the Game Boy Micro all going strong as publishers like Sega and Sony exited and entered the same arena. Now, the emergence of smartphones has kind of put a damper on handheld-only gaming consoles, but the Game Boy's DNA lives on in the Switch, which is essentially the culmination of everything the Game Boy was trying to be, a home console-level gaming experience on the go. With the Game Boy brand sticking around for 30 years in one way or another, chances are you have some nostalgia for the system like I do. So, to mark off this amazing milestone, why not play some classics via the 3DS Virtual Console, or even dig out your old games? You could even check our D-Make series, which the amazing Tom Brown has put together, and really just relive some nostalgia for your very own. Happy 30th birthday, Game Boy. Here's hoping for 30 more, and a Game Boy Classic would be the most amazing thing ever, so Nintendo, if you're listening or watching this, please make it happen. And that's going to wrap up tonight's Nintendo Wiretap. I'll see you soon with yet another episode, but as always, until then, Stay wired in. Bye, guys.